The final lecture in Introduction to Politics. I'll entitle it Markings, Wayfinders, and Detours. In this course, we've covered a variety of paths, terrain, in terms of the issues we covered as an introductory journey on the pathway of politics. But I'd like to summarize in a hasty overview some of the main themes in closing. First of all, when people think politics, there is a tendency, which is a detour in many ways, to slip into skepticism or cynicism. Now, often when people do that, they have legitimate reasons. They inevitably pick on negative experiences, things said in which there's hypocrisy, betrayal, and then increasingly the enough evidence mounts up that cynicism and skepticism dominates. The problem of that, of course, is that they ignore all the good that is being done, all the things they are living off provided by politics, whether it's health care, universal health care, roads, education, clean food, or a whole variety of things. The COVID crisis, it's imperfectly being dealt with. At least it's being dealt with. If there was no government, no politics at all, we would be in a case similar to the Black Death in the late medieval period of time. And so the danger of cynicism is, as I mentioned, it leads often to paralysis and impotence when it comes to the public issue. And the fact is, we all live within a public square, as it were, public space. We inherit much of the good of it, which doesn't mean there are not places where legitimate criticisms can be made. But one detour is cynicism or skepticism, but often skeptics are not skeptical of skepticism, and cynics are not cynical of cynicism. And so this becomes an indulgent pose and posture that prevents people from meaningfully engaging public issues. Another approach to politics is what we would call the bourgeois temptation, in which, to sort of fast forward from the Roman tradition, in which the general perspective of many, particularly those in elite positions, was give people their bread in circuses, i.e., give them their jobs, give them education so they get paid well, and then give them the amusements, distractions in life, their vacations, their sports, a whole variety of what T.S. Eliot calls being distracted by distraction through distractions. And so it's like the Shire in The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings. Isolate oneself from the big, troubling, difficult issues of the world, and then basically indulge in what Locke would call the personal peace and prosperity, and don't ask any questions outside of that small little sphere of reference. And this leads to sort of an ostrich with its head in the sand when it comes to life, a shutting down on the bigger issues that make us human, or what Aristotle would talk about in terms of being we are social public animals in that sense. And to be human is not only be concerned with the basics of life, the necessities, but also to be concerned with the public thing, the Republica, in that sense. And so the second detour, in a sense, is the bourgeois temptation, in which people's lives shrink into essentially providing what are necessary goods, but not going beyond those necessary goods to the sufficient goods of communities themselves and people and the public good itself. So the bourgeois temptation is a detour also, but the bread in circuses is always a temptation in its varied forms and guises. And so when we think again of waymarks and detours, this can be a detour for many in which eyes become closed to the struggling, the suffering, the difficult issues of life itself. The third temptation, which is both draws from a good but can have Achilles' heels and blind spots, is what we call cultural politics. And certainly in the movement in the last 10 to 15 years with woke, social justice warriors, free speech movements, many of the hot button issues in the culture wars, identity politics, gender issues, racism, First Nations. These are all elements that haven't quite reached the formal political level, but they engage people at a cultural level. And so people can, through various forms of media and YouTube, various types of communication, they can engage in a rather heated manner colliding, challenging, rhetorical mudslinging, fire hosing one another, depending on where a person stands on these hot button issues in the culture wars. Sadly, so politics, and we get our word polite from politics, often the first, a victim of the culture wars is basic politeness, listening, civility in the midst of the journey itself. And so, although the movement towards woke is good, often people have to woke from woke itself to think much bigger and larger in terms of what the issues are. And the danger is within the culture wars, one group pushes hard one way and they don't listen to the opposite side, and equally the free speech movements and those on the right react to feeling in fact their voice is silenced and stilled by an ideological progressivism on the left. So cultural politics, even though a necessary, a good, often does not raise the level of intellectual discussion to a higher level. It often does not get beyond mere protest and advocacy politics as well. And when we think of introduction to a course in politics, the issues of ideas are very important, but if they get bogged down and immersed in the quicksand of a certain type of ideology, they do not move beyond a level basically of citizenship and civility in the midst of difficult issues. And hence politics becomes reduced to rams and rutting season clashing over interpretations of trendy issues or cause du jour issues in the culture wars, and civility is sacrificed on the cross in that sense. And cultural politics often is very cynical of formal politics as well. And so absolutely necessary when one thinks polos or city or politics in that sense, to think what is it that brings a people together in the city for the greater good or the common good of that city, rather than perpetuating fragmentation or the culture of blame and victimization, which then inevitably freezes people in how events are interpreted. This leads, of course, another detour, and often how history is interpreted. History, like a great mountain range, has many different places on it, and depending on the part of the mountain a person is coming from, a person is going to see different realities. And so ideology is often a way of approaching the mountain of large issues from one perspective, and hence not being able to see the other parts of the mountain. So for example, when a person only picks on negative views of history without seeing the good, inevitably they're going to get a distorted view of both history, but they apply that interpretation then to the hot button issues of the culture wars. These detours can be problematic, and how we rise beyond unhelpful and unhealthy detours on the political journey into helpful markings and wayfinders on the journey is very important. And so at the level of intellectual thought or intellectual events, absolutely essential that each person starts from a basic notion of humility, recognizing they're finite, they're fallible. What they see or how they see will determine what they see. The peers, the friends, the educational experiences they have will predetermine more or less what they see. And this is why we study great works of literature and philosophy and religion and theology and economics and culture and music, because they give us the full mountain range of thought from within which then we can see our small place on the mountain. As we move along in the journey of introduction to politics, inevitably move into the realm of formal politics and civil society. And so the journey into formal politics, as I mentioned earlier, often cultural politics collides with formal politics, because what underwrites it is a form of cynicism. One cannot trust MPs, MLAs. And so this alternate form of politics of protest and advocacy, of which non-government organizations exist, government assistant organizations, liberation groups, on the right, transnational corporations or multinational corporations, these become different actors and actresses on the stage of politics itself. But in the world of introduction to politics anyway, when we think formal politics, important always to understand that even though parties come and go, like seasons come and go, like clouds come and go in the sky, back of the clouds and seasons that come and go, there is the whole realm of the civil servant. So regardless of whether in BC we have a conservative, liberal, NDP, Green party, this does not mean doctors in hospitals come and go, or teachers at universities or K to 12 come and go. In fact, there's a stable structure that remains the same, even though parties have their moment in the sun and then disappear, usually for a period of time, only to reappear again. So when we think the relationship of politics and civil society at a structural level, important to recognize that we have built-in structures that remain the same, even though parties like clouds, as I say, come and go throughout time, and they do massage and tinker and change things. But there is a consistency and stability within structures themselves, and this relationship in politics between the structures, which are consistent, and the parties that come and go is certainly important and worthy of study. Within liberal democratic tradition, as we have looked at in comparative politics, there are, for example, between the United States and Canada, obvious affinities given where they come out of, but substantive difference also. And so the study of comparative politics can take us in the direction whether North American, Central America, Mexico, Latin America, Europe. But there are also forms of politics, and one thinks comparative politics, to step outside the liberal democratic tradition entirely. And so in the area of comparative politics, for those interested in studying politics outside of the liberal democratic tradition, China, Russia, Middle East, Africa, these are very important areas to study so that one doesn't become myopic or only think within a limited frame of political systems. And when one begins to think outside of a liberal democratic tradition, then you're into the area of international relations itself. And of course, an introduction to politics, international relations is a substantive area in which not only there's the study of states and different political systems entirely that step outside of the liberal democratic heritage, but there's the clash of the issues of cultural relativism and then different cultures absolutizing themselves, and then the attempt to articulate a way of embodying universal rights, which in principle are meant to say there are certain use of universal standards which transcend parties and political perspectives of systems of the left, the center, and the right. And this is certainly since World War II and the carnage and tragedy of Europe, but also in many other parts of the world, where human rights are undermined, they're ignored, or the abuse of them is justified for a variety of reasons. International relations at its best is an attempt to bring some sort of predictable stability, diplomacy, law and standards to the study of politics, to prevent wars that people have experienced either between states or within regions of the world itself. So the language of diplomacy, international law, United Nations, these are all attempts from an idealist perspective to argue that without this type of order, in fact, then all politics is the competition of one powerful state or regional organization against another. So an introduction to politics, there are wayfinders in terms of moving the world community and regional communities. There are markings in place that can lead to a greater good, but there is also constantly and perpetually the war of those who again and again see that power and ethnic identity and protecting one's own tribe and clan is foundational. And this leads to what Matthew Arnold would call in Dover Beach. ignorant armies clashing by night, each defending their little acreage and place on the mountain against those who they see threaten it. And so, in a course of international politics, always important to understand the idealist position, the realist position, the constructivist position, these different interpretive ways in which people try and make sense of both an attempt to stabilize the world order in the midst of an unstable world order. And depending on how that play is worked out and the act one is in it, an understanding of politics will be very different. And so, to some, there are detours in the world that we live in. These can be hot button issues in the culture wars in the West. They can be clashes of religions. They can be clashes of ethnic traditions that lead increasingly to the war of all against all, as Hobbes would say. There's also movements in which there's an attempt to put markings in place by which people can evaluate good, better, best, bad, worst, worst. And it is these wayfinders that can move us towards a better world, but there is always and always will be, and history, of course, is replete with such lessons. There's always opposition to that. And this is what makes the study of politics perennially fascinating, because humanity in its history and in contemporary sense is always aspires towards the good, but there's constantly within the human heart, within the soul, and with society, opposition to that and different interpretations of how that's brought about. And this is what makes politics at the level of international relations, comparative politics, political philosophy or theory, and then also Canadian politics itself significant and important, because only those who totally retreat from the fray and put their head in the sand can hide away from these issues. But meanwhile, the great drama of life ever continues. And inevitably, one and all are affected by choices, by situations. And of course, in conclude, something like COVID itself highlights the interdependent nature of the ecosystem we live in, and choices and actions made in one part of the world are going to have serious impact on others. Hence, to ignore politics is in many ways to be blind to what's going on in the world and to participate in what Hannah Arendt would some ways call the banality of evil. People who see themselves as good, but they close their mind, heart, and imagination to the larger issues of the world. And the banality of evil then becomes the evil of banality itself. And so Hannah Arendt is a key figure in certainly in understanding, as any of you go forward, why the study of politics is essential, and to ignore it is to ignore some of the most important elements of the human journey itself.